ADHD procrastination versus avoidance versus burnout. Why they look the same but aren't. If you have ADHD, you've probably been told you procrastinate too much. You may have even accepted that label yourself. But what often gets missed is that procrastination, avoidance, and burnout are not the same thing, even though they can look identical on the surface. You might be sitting there, unable to start something, feeling stuck, distracted, or numb, and assume you're procrastinating again. But underneath that stuckness could be avoidance driven by emotional threat, or burnout driven by exhaustion. Treating all of these states as procrastination is one of the biggest reasons ADHD advice fails. From the outside, all three look similar. A task doesn't get done, time passes, guilt builds, but inside the nervous system, very different things are happening. Procrastination is often a delay when energy and capacity are still available. Avoidance is a protective response to emotional discomfort or threat. Burnout is a state of depleted capacity, where the system simply doesn't have enough energy to engage. When you confuse these states, you end up applying the wrong solution and making the problem worse. Let's start with procrastination. With ADHD, procrastination often happens when a task feels boring, unclear, or not immediately rewarding. Dopamine levels are low, so the brain seeks stimulation elsewhere. You might scroll, clean, or do something more interesting while knowing you'll come back to the task later. In procrastination, there is usually still some underlying capacity. The task feels unpleasant, but not dangerous. Pressure, deadlines, or novelty can sometimes kickstart action. This is the version of procrastination most productivity advice is built around. Avoidance is different. Avoidance happens when a task carries emotional weight. It might be tied to fear of failure, fear of judgment, fear of disappointing someone, or fear of repeating past mistakes. The nervous system interprets the task as a threat. When this happens, executive function drops quickly. The body pulls away automatically. You don't just delay the task, you feel resistance at a physical or emotional level. Avoidance often shows up as distraction, fatigue, irritability, or shutdown. And unlike procrastination, pressure usually makes avoidance worse. Burnout is different again. Burnout occurs when capacity has been drained over time. Executive function is exhausted. Emotional regulation is fragile. Motivation is low or absent. In burnout, the issue isn't reluctance or fear, it's depletion. The system doesn't have enough energy to engage, even if the task is meaningful and emotionally safe. You may want to do things but feel unable to access the energy to start. Rest alone often doesn't fix this, because burnout involves more than sleep. It involves prolonged strain, without enough support. One of the reasons ADHD struggles are so misunderstood is that these states can overlap. You might start with procrastination, move into avoidance as shame builds, and eventually reach burnout. At that point, nothing works. Advice like just start, break it down, or try harder feels insulting because it assumes capacity that isn't there. When burnout is treated like procrastination, people blame themselves for not pushing through. That self-blame deepens exhaustion. Another reason these states get confused is that ADHD brains struggle with internal signals. It's not always easy to tell whether you're avoiding something emotionally or simply too tired to engage. Without clarity, it's tempting to default to self-criticism. You might assume the worst about yourself because that's what you've been taught to do. This misinterpretation fuels shame cycles and erodes self-trust. Understanding the differences matters because each state requires a different response. Procrastination benefits from novelty, structure, and clear rewards. Avoidance benefits from emotional safety, reduced pressure, and reassurance. Burnout benefits from reducing demands, restoring capacity, and changing unsustainable patterns. When you apply a procrastination solution to burnout, you increase strain. When you apply pressure to avoidance, you increase fear. When you wrest procrastination away, you may feel restless or guilty. Let's look more closely at how ADHD procrastination works. Procrastination often shows up when tasks lack clarity or interest. The brain doesn't see immediate payoff, so it resists engagement. This isn't defiance. It's dopamine economics. ADHD brains prioritize tasks that offer stimulation, urgency, or novelty. When those elements are missing, motivation drops. In this case, Changing the task environment, adding novelty, or creating urgency can help. Avoidance, on the other hand, is driven by emotional memory. Past experiences of failure, criticism, or overwhelm become associated with certain tasks. Even thinking about the task can trigger discomfort. The body reacts before the mind has a chance to intervene. You might feel tired, anxious, or numb. The urge to escape is strong. For avoidance, emotional validation and safety are more important than tactics. You need to lower the threat before you can engage. Burnout often shows up as a loss of emotional range. Things feel flat or heavy. Even enjoyable activities don't bring the same satisfaction. This can be frightening. You might worry that you've lost interest or purpose, but burnout isn't permanent. It's a signal that your system has been operating beyond its capacity. Recovery requires reducing load and rebuilding support, not pushing harder. One of the most damaging patterns is using shame to try to fix all three states. Shame might temporarily push procrastination, but it worsens avoidance and deepens burnout. Shame tells the nervous system that failure is dangerous. That increases stress and reduces executive function. Over time, shame becomes the default response, making it harder to identify what's actually going on. Another common mistake is expecting consistency across all states. ADHD capacity fluctuates. Some days you may have energy and focus, other days you don't. Expecting the same strategies to work every day ignores this reality. Flexibility is essential. You don't need one solution. You need a menu of responses based on what state you're in. Learning to differentiate these states starts with awareness. When you feel stuck, ask yourself gentle questions. Does this task feel boring or unclear, or does it feel emotionally heavy? Do I feel tired or depleted even thinking about starting? Is there fear, or is there exhaustion? These questions aren't meant to judge, they're meant to guide support. It's also important to recognize that moving between states is normal. You might experience procrastination in the morning, avoidance in the afternoon, and burnout by the end of the week. This doesn't mean you're failing. It means your system is responding to changing demands. Responding with curiosity, instead of criticism, preserves energy. Another layer is identity. Many people with ADHD internalize the idea that they're procrastinators. This label becomes self-fulfilling. When everything is framed as procrastination, you lose access to nuance. Replacing labels with understanding restores agency. You're not a procrastinator. You're a human with a nervous system responding to conditions. When you start responding correctly to each state, something shifts. Procrastination becomes manageable. Avoidance becomes understandable. Burnout becomes addressable. Instead of fighting yourself, you work with your system. This reduces friction and increases self-trust. It's also worth acknowledging grief. You may grieve the years spent blaming yourself for things that weren't actually procrastination. That grief is valid, but understanding now gives you a chance to do things differently going forward. Knowledge doesn't erase the past, but it changes the future. Inside Dopaloop Pro, we teach this distinction clearly because it changes everything. When you know whether you're procrastinating, avoiding, or burned out, you can respond with the right kind of support. This reduces shame, preserves energy, and makes progress possible again. If you want ADHD-friendly explanations and tools that help you work with your brain instead of against it, you'll find the link in the description.